Okay. The reading this morning comes from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the second book of Kings, chapter 5. In the time of Elisha, the prophet, who had been the protege of Elijah, the prophet, a well-respected commander of the Syrian army named Naaman, suffered from a severe skin disease. He learned that in Israel there was a prophet who could do some healing, and he went to his king and said, "I would like to go to the prophet in Israel and ask for healing. Could you write me a letter of recommendation?" And the king of Syria said, "Yes, you have been a good and faithful servant. I will write you a recommendation." Well, the recommendation was less recommendation and more demand. The letter actually said, "I have sent to you my servant Naaman, cure him of his skin disease." Well, the king was not the prophet. So the king, not knowing anything about the prior conversations, was like, "Holy cow, what is this king trying to do to me? Is he trying to pick a fight? Because I can't heal people." And so, as it was done in those days when people were in fear and upset and anxious, he started to tear his clothing. And that then upset and made anxious everyone around him. So the word got out to Elisha that the king was tearing his clothing because he had a demand placed on him for healing that he couldn't meet. That the king in Syria must have an expectation that the king could cure Naaman. Well, Elisha said, "It's okay, king. It's all right. Send him to me. And then the king of Syria will know that there is a prophet in Israel who can heal." So the king, very relieved, of course, sent Naaman on his way and toward Elisha. And Naaman had, of course, a traveling entourage, because this was a very successful military figure in his own society. And when he went from his country to Israel, he had an entourage with him, much like when our president or vice president or our secretary of state goes to another country, of course, they take a group of people with them. So they're moving along apace over to Elisha's area, and you have to know, he's sort of thinking about, wonder what's going to happen. And when he gets there, he's on his horse still, and he's just outside of the residence. One of Elisha's servants comes out and says, "You know what? Just go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan and you'll be fine." And Naaman is furious. He is so insulted because here he is, this dignitary, and Elisha doesn't even come out. Naaman is like, "What is this?" Right? I mean, here I've come all this way. I'm somebody really important. Can you see my entourage? Why am I being disrespected like this? So he turns and he starts heading back to Syria. But some of his entourage, some of his servants say to him, "You know, maybe you should just reconsider this. You know, if the prophet had told you to do something really outrageous and crazy, you would have done it, right?" "Oh, well, of course, whatever the prophet said would heal me, I would do that." Well, the prophet did say what would heal you through his servant. He said, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan." And so reluctantly, in the face of all this faith on behalf of, coming from his servants, he goes to the Jordan, he dips himself 7 times, and lo and behold, he is healed. Naaman was very surprised by this, because he thought that Elisha would have to come out, that he would have to pray to the God of Israel, and that he would wave his hand over the infected portions of his skin and say some maybe, special magic words, and that was how he would be healed. But no, just going into the Jordan was enough. Now, the story about Naaman illustrates how often our expectations can influence our experiences and set us up for disappointments. Naaman wanted to be healed. He fully believed that Elisha could heal him, but he had a particular set of expectations about how that was going to happen. We can imagine that he had created a mental picture of how this healing was going to take place. And as I said before, he sort of had an idea that there was this ritual that would have to be performed and certain words would have to be said. And of course, at least he imagined that the prophet would be there. On the journey from Syria to Israel, we can imagine that in these pictures that he created in his head, that he played them over and over and over again. And you know what? It's not uncommon, right? We've all had that experience where running up to some event, we imagine how it's going to take place. And sometimes we imagine it one way, and sometimes we imagine it the other way. And if you're my mother, you always imagine the worst. Sort of as a talisman against the worst happening, right? But the problem is, when we insist that reality match that imaginary expectation, it's not uncommon for us to feel kind of a distance or a disconnect between what we had been imagining and what was actually taking place. Because expectation really is pure speculation. It is a projection into the future of something that we want to have happen, or sometimes what we don't want to have happen. And the problem really arises when we become too attached to our belief that some particular thing will happen, or we cling to a preconceived notion or idea of what should be the case. Did you hear that should? What should be the case? Expectations are often grounded in experiences and act as shortcuts for interpreting what is happening around us. As such, they're meant to be a helpful and efficient way of assimilating new experiences into our lives. Expectations can, however, limit our full enjoyment of life experience when we let our stereotyped notions block out our vision and our imagination. I recently read about a man who sat at a Washington, D.C. metro station and started to play the violin. He played 6 Bach pieces for about 45 minutes during rush hour at a station where thousands of people were coming and going and making connections. During the 45 minutes, this man played the violin for all these commuters, and only one commuter stopped for a few seconds to listen, and another commuter dropped some money in the open violin case as that commuter was rushing by. The overwhelming majority of adults simply ignored the violin player and his music, though many of them were standing nearby waiting for their next train. They never made eye contact. They didn't nod their heads in the musician's direction, and they didn't applaud in between pieces. They simply acted as if he weren't there. Apparently, the only people who actually paid some attention to the musician were some children that came by individually with their parents and saw the musician and heard the music and wanted to stay to hear more, but their parents pulled them along. And they did that stereotypical thing that little kids do when they don't want to leave, you know, and you have to drag them. But they're the only ones that seem to really recognize that there was a musician here playing beautiful music. When the man stopped playing and silence took over, no one seemed to notice. No one applauded or gave any recognition of the gift that he had offered them. The violinist was Joshua Bell. The violinist was Joshua Bell, one of the best musicians in the world. For these commuters, he had played one of the most intricate pieces ever written on a violin worth $3.5 million. 2 days before his incognito performance in the subway, he had played to a sold-out theater in Boston where the average ticket price was $100. That was some good violin playing that was going on at that metro station. This incognito performance was organized by the Washington Post as a social experiment. Because he was playing in the metro station and not in a fancy theater, people assumed he was just a street musician playing for handouts and paid little attention to him or his music. They saw and heard what they expected to see and hear from someone in a metro station playing a violin. It was only the few children who, unburdened by preconceived notions about where good music comes from, responded as though they were listening to the extraordinary music that Joshua Bell was actually playing. They were the ones who truly appreciated what they heard and saw. And unlike the adults around them, they were not so intent on getting somewhere else that they completely missed the experiences offered by the journey. In this case, the only consequence for the adults' failure to notice what was exceeding their expectations was just a failure to enjoy what would have been a life-enhancing, or at least a journey-enhancing musical experience. Both Naaman and the commuters shared a similar expectation that only the dramatic, the larger-than-life performance, and the invocation of all the trappings of power and mystery would provide and produce meaningful results. And in both cases, their expectations limited their ability to understand the significance of what they were experiencing. Naaman almost lost the opportunity to be healed, and the commuters did miss the opportunity to get lost in the beauty of a master musician's performance. There's an additional element in each story that I'd like to point out here. It's an element that's present in Naaman's story, but not in the commuter's story. It's the element of community. But for the wisdom and encouragement of Naaman's servants and the temporary traveling community that was made by his journey and those who went with him, he would have missed being healed because his expectations were affronted, and so he was just going to turn around and leave. So but for them and their presence and their wisdom and their insight, he would have missed the whole thing. In the commuter's story, although they were all together, lots and lots and lots of adults, they didn't really have any relationship to each other. They weren't creating any kind of community. They weren't looking out for each other. And so, unfortunately for them, our culture rarely recognizes the innate wisdom and insight of children. If it did, perhaps the children could have played the role of the servants in the Naaman story. But we so often just disregard what children see and what they hear, and we just pull them along on our agenda. And so in the commuter's story, that's what happened, and the commuters lost out. Another problem with expectations is that too often we project our own expectations on others and are disappointed when they don't act in ways consistent with them. On Allie Worthington's life coaching website, I read about a college professor who planned everything he knew his wife would want for her birthday. He wanted her to be wonderfully surprised when she got home from work, so he prepared her favorite meal. He dimmed the lights. He placed scented candles around the room. He created a centerpiece with her favorite flowers and played softly the music he knew she loved. He had it all set out for her. But when she walked through the front door, she immediately put down her briefcase, hung her coat on the hook, and said, I've had a horrible day. I'm not even hungry. I'm going to go take a bath. She never even made it into the living room or the dining room. She had no idea what her husband had been up to, but she had had one of the most taxing days that she had had lately, and all she wanted to do was relax. Well, you can imagine the professor was originally very angry at his wife. How dare she? He worked so hard. What? Where was her appreciation? Ungrateful. In all the ways that he had imagined this evening going, it never occurred to him that one of the ways would include his wife being so totally drained by work that all she wanted was a good long soak in a nice hot tub. Then, after his initial disappointment, frustration, and anger, he realized that he was making himself feel so miserable. That he was upset because she didn't meet his expectation for how the evening was going to go, but that was so unfair of him to project that on her because she didn't know anything about the evening. She was just being honest about what her needs were in that moment. We've all had similar experiences, whether or not we realized at the time that expectations were the culprit. But we can manage the expectations that could arise in our life, so we aren't affected by their consequences so much. We can do a few things that will help us out. We can communicate, for instance. Being clear about what you expect, being open to being educated about what is possible, and then adjusting to meet actual expectations and actual circumstances is one way of avoiding that big chasm between what you expect and what actually happens. When we, like the professor, operate solo with expectations that are not grounded in reality, we set ourselves up for disappointment. Think about this. Had the professor given his wife a call to find out how her day was? To discuss what she might consider a perfect end to her birthday? He could have diverted his efforts to providing her with a relaxing spa experience, the likes of which she had never imagined she could have at home, rather than an elaborate dinner that sat on the stove getting cold. We can invite those with whom we are in community to reality test our expectations for us. Like Naaman's servants, those who love us and know us are in a particularly good position to help us moderate the unrealistic expectations that we sometimes create for ourselves and for others. And we can become more mindful of what we are doing and expecting at any given time. Being in the present, focused on what is going on around us, and not living in a state of future expectation all the time, grounds us in what is real and opens up the possibility of enjoying the unexpected. Had the commuters rushing through the Washington, D.C. metro system been more present and mindful, they would likely have had room for the unexpected gift that a world-renowned musician was offering to them. When we practice staying in the sacred now, the future will take care of itself as well as is possible. We cannot know the mysteries of how life unfolds, or even if a certain outcome that seems desirable to us right now, if it occurred, actually would end up being as desirable as we think. By communicating, reality testing, and being mindfully present to now, we can attune ourselves to that which is loving and benevolent in life. what else would we choose to align ourselves with? I invite you for a moment of musical meditation.